Hey everyone, how's it going? Welcome back to InfoGamer. In this lesson, I'm going to be talking about Azure Cloud Functions for Playfab. Now, in a previous video, I showed you how to set up your Visual Studio Code environment for creating Azure Cloud Functions. And in that video, we created an Azure Function app, which created our first function script. Now, function apps are how Azure groups together your scripts and functions that deal with a single application. Where a function script is just one script that will usually only hold one single function. You can add more than one function to a single script, but the way that the environment is set up and how Azure handles their function apps, it's almost better to organize each function into their own script. Now with Visual Studio Code opened, we're going to get started by selecting the Azure tab on the left side of the screen. We're then going to create a new function script by going down to the workspace window, clicking the plus sign, and selecting Create Function. This will then give us the option of choosing which kind of function we want to create, and we're just going to select HTTP trigger. It then wants us to give our function a name, and I'm just going to type Hello World. This can be whatever you want, but you don't want to have any duplicate functions within the same function app. We then need to give our function a namespace, and I'll just type democompany.demofunctionapp. I'll then select Anonymous, and here you can see that Visual Studio Code has created our new function script. Now the nice thing about the switch over to Azure Functions instead of the Playfab Cloud scripts is that these scripts are written in C#, which is the same language that we use for Unity. Whereas the Playfab Cloud scripts were written in JavaScript. Now when your script is created, your function will be contained within its very own class. The class name will be the same as your function, and your typical function structure is here where it says public static async task iActionResult and run. Run is the function name in this local file, but before this where it says function name hello world, that's how Azure, Playfab, and your Unity project will reference this function. And when you create these functions, you'll notice that the local function name will always be run by default. And so you'll just want to make sure that this name isn't a duplicate. I often just put a 2 or a 3 or a 4 after the run. And another thing that I'll do at the very beginning is I'll change this task type from iActionResult to dynamic. This will allow us to return pretty much any type, and we'll be able to receive that value as its type in Unity. Now before we get started in writing our script for Playfab, there's a few more things that we need to do. The first is that we need to install the Playfab SDK for Visual Studio. To do this, we'll go down to the terminal window and we'll type .NET add package then Playfab all SDK. And you'll need to do this for every project and function app that you create. Next up, we need to select the Explorer tab and select our CS project file. In here below the Azure function version number, we need to add a line of code, which is the define constraints tag netcore app2_0, and then the closing define constraints tag. Once I've done this, I'll go back to my hello world script. And in here we can now add the using playfab.serverModels namespace. Once you've done this, there's a couple of classes that I like to add to the namespace I'm using for my function app. And these classes just help with connecting our cloud script with Playfab and our Unity project. The first class is a public class which I've called Title Authentication Context. And in here we have a public string of type ID with a get and set, and another public string called entity token with a get and set. The second class is also a public class, which I've called Function Execution Context, and we want to add a generic type to this class, and so I have a capital T inside of carets. Inside this class, we want to have a public variable of type playfab.profilemodels.entityProfileBody, and I've called this caller entity profile. We then have a public variable of type title authentication context. I've called this title authentication context. We then have a public bool with a question mark operator, which I've called generate playstream event. And finally, we have a public generic type, so I have a capital T, and this is called function argument. Now inside our function, we want to use these newly created classes to do a little bit of setup. The first is reading data from the HTTP request so we can get certain values out of it. So I'm going to create a new function execution context of type dynamic. This is going to be called context, and we're setting it equal to JSON convert.deserialize object. The type is function execution context dynamic, and in parentheses we have await our rec parameter var.readAsStringAsync. After this, we're going to create a new Playfab API setting variable. So I have var API setting equals new playfab.playfab API setting. And in curly brackets, we want to set the title ID equal to context.titleAuthenticationContext.id. And then for the developer secret key, we actually need to go to our Playfab dashboard. And with our app selected, we're going to click the gear icon in the top left corner, select title settings, and then under the secret keys tab, I can select my default key and paste it in here as a string. Next up, we want to create a variable of type playfab.playfabAuthenticationContext. And for these classes that I have with playfab. You could actually just add the using playfab namespace up at the top, and then you could get rid of the playfab. This variable is going to be called title context. I'm going to set it equal to a new playfab.playfabAuthenticationContext. We're then going to set the entity token of this title context variable. So I have title context.entity token equals context.titleAuthenticationContext.entity token. And now we can create a variable of type playfab.playfabServerInstanceAPI. So I have var server API equals new playfab.playfabServerInstanceAPI. And in parentheses, I'm passing in our API settings and our title context variable. Now that's all the setup that we need to do. And once we've done this setup, the rest of this function could be executing normal C# computations, but the main purpose of using a cloud script is for executing server requests that need to be executed in a more secure way than directly on the client's device. And many of these requests are the same requests that the player can execute on their client using the Playfab client API, but in these scripts we'll be using the server API. So to give you an example of one of these requests, I'll show you how to request title data from Playfab. For this, we'll start by creating a getTitleDataRequest variable. So I have getTitleDataRequest. I'm calling this variable TitleDataRequest, and we're setting it equal to a new getTitleDataRequest. In curly brackets, we want to pass in the different keys for the title data that we want to request. So I have keys equals new list of type string, and if list isn't recognized, it's because we need to add the using.system.collections.generic namespace up at the top, just as we would inside of Unity. Then in this list, I could add all of the keys that I want to request. And so I'll just pass in one string, which I'll call key. Now this next part is a little different, where in Unity, with the client API, you would send this request using the getTitleData function call, and you'd pass in the request as the first parameter, and then you'd have a success return function and a failed return function. And inside the success callback function, you would have the title data as a parameter. For the cloud scripts, it actually just returns the title data. And so we first need to create a variable. So I have var title data result, and we're setting it equal to await server API.getTitleDataAsync. And in parentheses, we're passing in the title data request. Now because this function call is asynchronous, Azure won't execute the next line of code until we get a result. But once we get a result, we can check what that result is by saying if titledata.result.result.data.contains_key, and we can pass in key as the parameter. We can then do whatever we want with this key. In my case, I'm just going to return all the keys. So I have return title data result.result.data. And here I'm getting an error because once again, you want to make sure that you change the task type to dynamic. Now that's everything that we're going to cover in this lesson on how to create an Azure function script, how to set up your Azure function script so that it'll work with Playfab and your Unity project, and then how to do a basic request and get the results. Now if you enjoyed this lesson, make sure that you give it a thumbs up, leave any questions you have in the comments below, and subscribe to our channel so you can be up to date with all our latest videos. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. Now when your script is created, your function will be contained within its very own class.